Okay, so we've got a really interesting one to dive into today. You sent over some materials about this Soren Law Group,
Hmm.
a family law firm over in Staten Island,
Right. Yeah.
and specifically about Karen B. Soren, who's running the show over there.
Hmm.
And you know what I'm really interested in is, well, first of all, just what's at the heart of this firm, you know, what makes them tick? And then also, how are they maintaining this legacy?
Right.
Because it sounds like they've been around for a while, and it's not just about continuing what was already there, but actually sort of building on it,
Hmm.
evolving it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you've hit the nail on the head, and I think the material you've given us gives us a really good starting point
Okay, great.
to kind of unpack that, from the very beginning, what the principles were to what they're actually doing in the community now.
Yeah, okay, cool. So let's go all the way back to the beginning.
Okay.
We're talking 1999.
Mm-hmm.
Stephen J. Soren founds this firm, Soren Law Group.
Mm-hmm.
And right away, when you look at the material, you see these key ideas popping up: integrity,
Yeah.
empathy, and this real sense of tireless advocacy for their clients.
Yeah, and you can really see it in everything they do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you get the sense right away that he was not only, a really good lawyer, but also that he brought this strong ethical compass to the
Yeah.
work
Mm.
and this deep commitment to the people that he was serving.
It really comes across. I mean, it's one thing to be, skilled and knowledgeable in the law, but it's a whole other level to bring that integrity piece.
Hmm.
That, doing what's right, even when it's tough. And especially in family law,
Oh, absolutely.
where things are so emotionally charged.
Right.
That empathy piece, I think, is invaluable.
Right.
To really understand where your clients are coming from, what they're going through, and then, it's this tireless advocacy.
Right.
And that just speaks to a deep commitment to really fighting for the best possible outcome.
Right. So you have that. You have that foundation.
Right.
And then, of course, as happens in life, things change.
Right.
And we see with Stephen's passing that suddenly there's this responsibility, this weight falls to Karen B. Soren, to not only keep the firm going, but to carry on that vision.
Yeah, and that's a huge moment
Yeah.
for any organization, I think, but especially when it's so tied to very specific personal values.
Right.
It's not just about maintaining things. You have to build on that legacy.
Mm-hmm.
And for that, you need a very clear vision for the future. And I think, the fact that Karen took over,
Right.
and she had already 2 decades of experience in family law herself,
Right.
it says a lot about how connected she already was to the firm's values.
Right. So that to me speaks to a really seamless transition, at least in terms of the principles at play.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you look at Soren Law Group today, it's very clear from the material that they're focused on providing this really empathetic
Yeah.
legal support in this world of family law, which,
Mm-hmm.
as we all know, can be incredibly complicated.
Oh, for sure.
And they're doing it specifically for people in Staten Island.
Right.
Just that local connection seems to be really important to them.
It often is, because understanding not only the specific laws, but the local courts,
Yeah.
the procedures, even the community itself,
Right.
can be a real advantage for clients who are, dealing with these incredibly personal matters.
Absolutely.
It's not just an abstract legal problem.
Right.
It's tied to their lives,
Right.
to their community.
Right.
So, having a firm that is so deeply rooted in Staten Island probably gives them a real edge in understanding the specific challenges their clients are facing.
Right. Makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
Okay, so we've talked about the legacy, we've talked about the local focus.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go back to this idea of the legacy for a second.
Okay.
Because the materials really emphasize how Stephen J. Soren, when he started, had this passion for justice,
Yeah.
this deep commitment to each and every client.
Uh-huh.
And it describes that as being like the bedrock, the foundation of the firm.
Mm-hmm.
So what does that actually look like in practice? Like, how does that foundational passion manifest?
Well, I think you see it in the firm culture.
Okay.
It's not just about going the extra mile for your clients. It's that becomes the expectation.
Right.
It's how everyone operates.
Right.
And it's about more than just, processing cases. It's about a genuine desire to help people through what is often a very difficult time in their lives
Right.
and to make sure they feel heard and represented. And I think that kind of energy, that the founder brings
Yeah.
really sets the tone for years to come.
Right. And then, of course, Karen steps in.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just about, keeping things running. It's about upholding that legacy
Right.
and even expanding upon it.
Right.
And, we see in the material, they mention her 2 decades of experience.
Yeah.
Her reputation as being this really respected family lawyer in New York.
Yes.
And that doesn't happen overnight.
No, it takes time. It takes consistency.
Right.
Building that kind of respect, I mean, it really says a lot. It means she has a track record of success,
Right.
a commitment to ethical practice,
Mm-hmm.
and she's got the respect of her peers.
Yeah.
And, I think having that already in place was so important for reassuring clients and really the whole legal community that, the firm was in good hands.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
it's going to stay strong and continue in that same direction.
What also really stood out to me was this description of her approach as this real blend of compassion
Yeah.
with serious legal expertise.
Right.
And I feel like in family law,
Mm-hmm.
where things are already so, emotionally charged,
Oh, absolutely.
having both of those is vital, right?
But is it hard to find that balance?
It's a tough one. You need the legal skills, the knowledge
Yeah.
to navigate this really complex world of laws and procedures.
Right.
But if you don't have the empathy to understand the human element,
Right. The fear, the uncertainty, even the pain that people are going through, then it's hard to really advocate for their best interests in a holistic way. It can't just be about the law.
yeah.
So yeah, being able to combine those two, that's the mark of a really great family law practice.
Yeah.
And it allows for both strong advocacy and a really supportive experience for the client.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So speaking of client experience, the materials talks a lot about Soren Law Group's client-centered approach.
Yes.
And they highlight Karen's commitment to really listening to what clients are going through
Uh-huh.
and tailoring legal strategies to their specific situations.
All right.
So it's not about one-size-fits-all solutions.
No, and that's so important.
Right.
Every case is different.
Right.
It has its own facts, its
Yeah.
own emotional kind of landscape,
Mhm.
and its own specific goals. And a firm that takes the time to really understand those individual nuances is much better equipped to actually develop strategies that meet the client's needs and what they're trying to achieve.
Right.
Yeah.
And they also really emphasize that from the very first meeting all the way through to how the case is resolved, they're providing this very clear, very honest, strategic advice. And I imagine that kind of transparency is incredibly valuable for people who are often going through such a stressful and confusing legal process.
Oh, for sure. It can be so overwhelming,
Right. Yeah.
especially when it's something so personal. So yeah, that clear communication builds trust.
Right.
And it empowers clients to make informed decisions about their future. And then the strategic advice piece ensures that those decisions are grounded in a clear understanding of the law and the possible outcomes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Now, it seems like their overarching goal is to try and minimize both the emotional toll and the financial burden that these legal disputes can have on families. And that speaks to a real understanding of how these situations can impact people's lives, right?
Absolutely.
It's not just about the legal outcome.
Right.
It's about everything else that comes along with it. So I thought that was really telling.
It's about recognizing that legal proceedings, they have this ripple effect.
Yeah.
It's not just about winning or losing a case.
Right.
If you're not thinking about the emotional and financial well-being of the client, you can end up with a victory that doesn't feel like a victory.
Right. Right.
So a truly client-centered approach takes all of that into account.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, in terms of how they actually go about resolving these disputes, Soren Law Group seems to have a really interesting approach.
Yeah.
Because they talk about exploring alternative ways to do things, like mediation
Right.
or collaborative law, as a way to try and find a solution without, all the conflict that can sometimes come with going to court.
Right.
But they also acknowledge that sometimes going to court is unavoidable.
Yeah, and I think that's a very responsible position to take.
Yeah.
Alternative dispute resolution, like mediation, where you have a neutral third party helping people come to a settlement or collaborative law where both sides and their attorneys agree to work together respectfully.
Right.
These can often lead to more amicable and cost-effective outcomes,
Yeah.
especially when children are involved.
Right.
But, they also understand that sometimes litigation is the only way to really protect a client's rights.
Right.
So you have to be prepared to do that too.
So it's about having all the tools in the toolbox and knowing when to use which one.
Exactly.
Now, the material lays out these 4 core commitments of the firm, and these seem to be the real guiding principles behind their work.
Right.
So the first one is client-centered advocacy, which we've talked about a bit,
Yeah.
really emphasizing personalized attention and open communication.
And that really highlights that the client is at the center of everything.
Yeah.
It's about making sure that the client feels heard, understood.
And that they're part of the process.
Right.
Not just a case number.
Right. The second one is efficiency and resolution, which ties into what we were just talking about with alternative dispute resolution.
Right.
It's about finding the most effective way forward without dragging things out unnecessarily.
Yeah, and efficiency in this context, it's not just about speed.
Right.
It's about using resources wisely, both time and money,
Right.
to get the best result.
Yeah.
And sometimes that means a quick negotiation.
Right.
And sometimes it means, a more deliberate approach through the courts.
The third core commitment is the protection of families, which I feel like is really the overarching aim of everything they do.
It is.
It's about focusing on the best interests of everyone involved,
Right.
especially the children.
Yeah, family law isn't just about, resolving a dispute between two people.
Right.
It's about the impact on the whole family unit.
Right.
And so you have to think about, the broader implications of your actions.
And try to find solutions that minimize harm and promote well-being, especially for the kids.
And then the fourth and final commitment is integrity and excellence.
Yes.
Which brings us back to those founding principles that we talked about. Operating with honesty, being professional,
Right.
having this strong ethical code.
And that's really the baseline.
Yeah.
For any reputable law practice.
Right.
Clients need to trust that their attorneys are not only competent,
Right.
but that they're operating with integrity
Right.
and the highest ethical standards.
Absolutely. So they have these core commitments, and then they go on to list all the different services that they provide. And it's really a comprehensive range of family law services.
It is.
So they handle divorce, both contested, meaning there's disagreements,
Right.
and uncontested, where things are more straightforward.
Yeah.
And that also includes the often very complicated issues of how you divide property and how you determine things like spousal support.
Right.
So that's a big area.
Yeah. And you can see that they really understand the different needs that come up in family law.
Yeah.
And, divorce in particular can get really complex,
Yeah.
both financially and personally.
Yeah.
So having that expertise in things like, equitable distribution of assets and spousal maintenance is critical.
Absolutely. They also handle child custody and visitation,
Right.
which is such a sensitive area,
Oh, for sure.
really focusing on creating parenting plans that work and protecting the rights of the parents.
Yeah, those are often the most emotionally charged issues in family law.
Right.
And you need an experienced attorney to navigate that, always keeping the best interests of the child as the priority.
Right. And of course, there's child support
Mm-hmm.
and modifications because, these financial arrangements often need to change
Right.
as situations evolve.
Right.
And they make sure to highlight that.
Yeah, child support orders are not set in stone.
Right.
As people's incomes change, their needs change.
Right.
You need to be able to make sure that things stay fair and appropriate for everyone.
Right. For both the parents and the children.
Exactly.
Now, they also offer legal separation, which is an alternative to divorce
Right.
for couples who want to formally separate but stay legally married.
Yeah.
Why would someone choose that?
Well, there can be lots of reasons.
Okay.
Sometimes it's for religious reasons.
Right.
Sometimes it's to maintain health insurance benefits.
Okay.
Sometimes it's seen as a step towards maybe reconciling.
Right.
Or at least a way to sort things out legally and financially without the finality of a divorce.
Right. They also deal with paternity law, which is all about establishing legal parenthood.
Yes.
And that has huge implications for both the parents and the children.
Yeah, absolutely. Making sure that both parents' rights and responsibility are recognized. That's crucial. And it affects everything from child support to inheritance.
And then they also handle prenuptial agreements, the ones you make before you get married,
Right.
and postnuptial agreements, which are made after you're already married. And both of those are really about protecting your financial interests.
Exactly. They provide clarity. They provide security.
Right.
They help couples define, their rights and responsibilities when it comes to money.
Yeah.
And it can help avoid big disputes if the marriage doesn't work out.
Right. And finally, they offer collaborative law and mediation.
Yes.
Which again shows how committed they are to finding these non-adversarial ways to resolve things.
Exactly. It's about finding solutions that are constructive,
Yeah.
that prioritize communication and agreement,
Yeah.
And that can often lead to much better outcomes for families in the long run.
Okay, so we've covered this really comprehensive set of services that they offer.
Mm.
But the material also talks about some of the recognition that Karen and Soren Law Group have received.
Right.
They mentioned things like super lawyers rankings and NAFLA rankings.
Yeah.
So for anyone who's not familiar with those, what do those types of accolades actually mean in the legal world?
Well, they're usually third-party evaluations,
Okay.
and they look at attorneys based on a number of factors. Their achievements, their recognition by other lawyers, and often client satisfaction as well.
Right.
So rankings from organizations like Super Lawyers and the National Academy of Family Law Attorneys, which is NAFLA,
Right.
they suggest that Karen and her firm have been recognized for their competence, their ethical standards, and for getting good results for their clients.
Yeah.
So it's a really good indication of a strong reputation and, a consistent track record of success.
Yeah. So it's not just them saying they're good at what they do. It's other people recognizing it as well.
Exactly.
Now, beyond the legal work within the firm, they also talk about Karen's involvement in the Staten Island community.
Yeah.
And it mentions her participating in these legal education initiatives and mentoring young attorneys. So that speaks to a commitment that goes beyond just their clients.
It does.
Right.
It's about giving back to the community.
Yeah.
It's about supporting the legal profession as a whole. Mentoring the next generation of lawyers. That's so important for the future.
Right.
And, participating in those legal education initiatives. It helps people understand their rights, their responsibilities.
Right. And then the firm itself is committed to doing pro bono work.
Yes.
Which is providing legal help to people who can't afford it.
Right.
And they also support local organizations focused on family welfare. So it's like they're really plugged into the needs of the community.
They are. And pro bono work is so important.
Yeah.
It makes sure that everyone has access to justice.
Right.
Regardless of how much money they have.
And supporting those family welfare organizations shows that they're really invested in the well-being of Staten Island.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that, because Karen's also continuing this civic involvement that her late husband was known for, Stephen Soren. Material mentions his work with the Staten Island Children's Museum and other organizations.
Yeah.
So you can see how this connection to the community is really woven into the fabric of the firm.
Yeah, it's not just something they do on the side. It's really part of who they are.
It is.
So as we sort of wrap up this deep dive into Soren Law Group,
Okay.
the main things that stand out to me are this incredibly strong foundation built on integrity, empathy that Stephen established, and how Karen has not only maintained that but grown it, with her own expertise and her commitment to putting clients first.
Yeah, and I think what really emerges here is a picture of a firm that is rooted in these core values. They're not just words.
Right.
And they have this high level of legal competence, but they also have a genuine concern for the well-being of their clients and the community.
Yeah.
And that transition in leadership seems to have gone really smoothly because of that commitment to the original mission.
Right. And it really makes you think about the importance of both having that strong initial vision and the kind of leadership that can adapt and grow.
Right.
To maintain that excellence and that positive impact on the community.
Yeah. And that's not always easy.
No.
To sustain those things when leadership changes. So I think Soren Law Group is a really good example of how it can be done.
Right. And so for you, the listener, maybe think about organizations or people in your own experience who have had to navigate those kinds of transitions. And how have they managed to stay true to their values while also adapting to new circumstances?
That's a great question to think about.
So if you found this deep dive into Soren Law Group helpful, and you happen to be in Staten Island, New York, and in need of family law services, you can reach them at 718-815-4500. That's 718-815-4500. Their website is sorenlawgroup.com. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
We'll catch you next time.
Sounds good.